The novel follows Jude, a young man navigating life after a series of transformative events. Set against the backdrop of San Diego, Jude's journey begins with a hesitant step into a gay dance club, coerced by his brother Beck and Beck's partner Diego, who are intent on pulling Jude out of his shell following a heartbreak involving Levi Hammond. Jude's world, however, is far from ordinary. He finds himself entangled in a supernatural web that includes werewolves, vampires, and angels. After rescuing the angel Ramiel, Jude receives a heartfelt message from another celestial being, Hydra, expressing gratitude and promising eternal support. Jude's life intertwines with Levi's, his werewolf mate, whose safety becomes paramount amidst threats from the vampire Barnabas and an Iowan agent named Sterling Jones, who has infiltrated their world and potentially betrayed many. Burdened with newfound responsibilities and the need to protect his pack, Jude grapples with feelings of inadequacy. Despite being only 20, attending college, and living with his brother, Jude is forced to confront challenges beyond his years. Levi's abduction and subsequent rescue leave scars both physical and emotional, but also bring about a deeper connection between Jude and the supernatural community. The narrative weaves through Jude's personal growth, his deepening bond with Levi, and his struggle to reconcile his mundane life with the extraordinary circumstances he finds himself in. The appearance of a mysterious blue card with a message from Hydra hints at Jude's crucial role in a larger cosmic drama, suggesting that he is part of a greater family that transcends human understanding. Emotional moments punctuate the story, such as Jude discovering the healed wounds on Levi's back, once a site of torture, now adorned with protective angelic script. These instances highlight the resilience of love and loyalty amidst chaos. Jude's encounters with supernatural beings, like Ramiel and Hydra, underscore the theme of chosen families and the idea that one's true belonging can extend beyond bloodlines. As Jude learns to harness his inner strength and accept help from unexpected quarters, the novel explores themes of self-discovery, love, sacrifice, and the complexities of belonging. It ultimately tells a tale of overcoming personal limitations and embracing a destiny intertwined with the supernatural, all while navigating the treacherous path towards saving those he loves and finding a place where he truly belongs. Chapter 1. Jude. Jude had never been to a gay dance club before. He wasn't interested in what went on inside the clubs, but his brother Beck had been nagging him to get out of the house. He'd moved to San Diego 6 months ago, and the only place he went willingly was to his college classes. Any other time Beck or his partner Diego hauled him out of the house. He regretted telling his brother about his brief thing with Levi Hammond. Beck watched him carefully and Jude knew why. He should have been over the short-term love affair by now, but his heart disagreed. Regardless of what others believed, just because Levi no longer loved Jude didn't mean Jude could simply turn his feelings off. But in order to get Beck off his back, Jude had said yes when a couple of friends invited him to go dancing. He imagined he had that tourist look when he stepped inside the club's doors. The thump of the music actually caused the pant legs of his jeans to tremble, in time with the pounding bass. He tried not to gawk, but he'd never seen the likes of what played out before him anywhere. After the shock wore off, his first impression was sex. Men writhed on the floor, emanating sensual appeal. He felt like prey walking into the lion's den, and all he could do was watch with astonishment at the gyrating bodies. Jude had been to a couple of high school dances over on the East Coast. The comparison between the two scenes was like pitting apples against pineapples. High school dances were, well, high school and not like the movies where all the kids had rhythm and could contort their bodies to do amazing moves. Jude snorted to himself. No, there were hawk-eyed chaperones and most of the students danced with a jerky stiffness or sat off to the side watching. Here, everybody moved fluidly, as if their bodies were boneless. The air smelled of sweat and sex, half-hard cocks prominently displayed in everything from leather to colorful mesh jockstraps. Following his friends through the writhing mass, he was petted and groped. Enough he'd have bruises on his ass. His friends seemed oblivious to his discomfort as they pushed through to the middle of the dance floor, pulling him along behind them. For a split second, he contemplated leaving, swamped with the wrongness of it all. His mind whispered his place was with Levi, not here among grabby strangers. That internal voice pissed him off. Levi had left, disappeared, and broken his promise, leaving Jude devastated and living like a monk. Twice Jude had hooked up only to come away carrying enough guilt to make him sick to his stomach for days over someone who had chosen to no longer be a part of his life. He was tired of being alone. of sitting in his room wondering what Levi was doing, of yearning for someone who would never come back for him. With newfound determination, he quit resisting, raised his hands in the air, and let go. He danced. The movement, the energy was cathartic. The stress left his body, and for once, he placed the ache in his soul on the back shelf and buried it. He blocked the negative emotion so he could, just for the night, be himself. He didn't believe he asked for too much. He only wanted a few short hours without the heartbreak, pain, or the memories that continually threatened to drown him. Jude moved to the beat. He didn't care how awkward he appeared. He tapped his feet, shook his ass, and cleared his mind. He danced until sweat poured off him, soaking his clothes and hair. Slowly, ever so slowly, he began to feel wonderful, alive. A shirtless Adonis approached him. The man was golden everywhere, his skin, shoulder-length hair. He even had golden brown eyes. Jude caught his breath because he'd never seen anyone so handsome. Well, handsome was relegated to the rugged attractiveness. No, the man dancing with Jude, with the sleek quality of a cat, was beautiful. He sucked in his breath as the stranger drew near with an uncertainty that was a contradiction to his appearance, and Jude recognized something of himself in the person approaching him. Jude found the man's hesitancy endearing and threw him a bone. Wrapping his arms around wide shoulders, they swayed together with the music. His large, liquid eyes drank Jude in as the Adonis matched him move for move, hands gliding and stroking, hips swaying in counter to Jude's. For the first time in a very long time, Jude felt sexy and wanted. "Come home with me," the Adonis whispered in Jude's ear between songs. Because Jude was flying high on a rare night of happiness, he did the one thing he hadn't done since he'd moved to San Diego. Yes. Jude envisioned a long night of hot, sweaty sex that would sustain his fantasies for weeks to come. The drive took mere minutes. Adonis hadn't put his shirt on when they left the club, and Jude watched it sway in his back pocket as he climbed the stairs to the apartment. The guy's hands trembled when attempting to fit the key into the lock. Jude didn't think, just acted. Grabbing the blonde by the elbow, the man's golden gaze raised from the doorknob to Jude's hand, and something dark rippled over the surface of his eyes. "Let me help," Jude offered to break the silence. "My name's Jude, by the way." He reached for the key, and in a quick move Jude was plastered with his back against the door. A hard body pressed up against him, the hard line of the man's erection pressing into him. "Ah, shit," Adonis moaned, pressing his nose into Jude's skin. They both were covered in sweat, and Jude could only imagine what he smelled like. It must not have been terrible, because a warm, broad tongue licked up the line of his neck. Stephen Thornstein," he said before his fumbling opened the door, and they practically fell onto the apartment entryway. After Stephen had slammed the door closed behind them, Jude repaid the favor and slammed Stephen against it. There wasn't any finesse to the kiss he laid on Stephen. He ignored the rising whispers in the back of his mind, noting how Stephen didn't taste like Levi or that his lips were too plump. He viciously shoved the comparisons away. Jude was starving, so very hungry for touch, for a connection, and he tried to devour Stephen's pouty lips. The niggling voice admonished him for his roughness, but the throaty growls Stephen gave him shut those thoughts down completely. Jude was just beginning to get lost in the feel of Stephen's skin against his own when a hand pressed down on his shoulder. "Suck me, please." Stephen's sweat-soaked blonde hair clung to his forehead. As he glanced down at Jude with a strange expression, a mixture of hope and need, Jude sank to his knees, attempting to ignore how wrong he felt. Both times he'd had sex since Levi, he'd battled the sickening twist in his gut. He shoved the rising feeling away, resolute that this time would be different. Stephen fumbled with the button and zipper of his pants, the bravado gone as his hands shook. Jude pushed his hands aside and freed Stephen's hard cock from his tight pants. A wave of guilt gripped Jude so hard he thought he would throw up. A pained moan came from Stephen. "Oh God, stop. I can't. I don't know what I was thinking." Jude sat back on his heels as Stephen's large golden hands covered his wilting erection before he quickly tucked himself away. "I'm so fucking sorry." Jude sighed, so relieved he couldn't speak. The knot in his stomach unraveled as the tension left him. Stephen babbled apologies, and Jude waved a hand to indicate no harm, no foul. But Stephen continued to prattle on, drawing Jude's attention to where Stephen was leaning against the front door. Jude thought he was an emotional mess, but perhaps Stephen was worse off than he was. I thought I was ready. I'm so sorry. I just couldn't go any further. Large, golden brown eyes, warm and liquid, stared down at Jude with an anguish Jude recognized. It's okay, man, he placated, and Stephen regarded him as if he were crazy. Seriously. You weren't the only one who was having second thoughts. He attempted to give a cocky grin but failed when his lips barely curled up. Stephen offered a hand to Jude, and Jude accepted it, allowing Stephen to haul him to his feet. You want a drink? He should go home, but he didn't want to just yet. Jude was tired of hiding in his own bedroom. Yeah, sure. Stephen motioned Jude toward the large sectional couch that took up half the living room. Stephen had his own mini library, with floor-to-ceiling black bookshelves occupying the other half of the space. Jude didn't see a TV or stereo, only an iPod docking station. The huge square coffee table was covered in open texts and multiple spiral-bound notebooks with scribblings in what appeared to be different languages in them. Stephen returned holding two long necks and handed one to Jude. I feel like I should explain. A light blush pinked Stephen's cheeks. It's really unnecessary. Jude didn't want Stephen to feel like he had to make a full confession. You weren't the only one who struggled. As soon as he said the words, Jude realized he'd chosen the wrong ones. Stephen blanched and glanced away. Shit, what I meant to say was I had my own internal battle going on, trying not to feel guilty. Now Jude's cheeks grew warm with his own blush of embarrassment. Stephen released a gusty sigh. Is it terrible that I'm glad I wasn't the only one? Not that I would wish this awkward situation on anyone, but seriously, I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only poor bastard out there trying to get over a messy relationship. Stephen took a long draw of his beer. Let me start this over. He reached a hand across the couch. Stephen Thornstein, antiquities dealer and recently dumped by my longtime partner. Jude grinned and accepted his hand in a firm shake. Jude Zell college student, and I'm mooning over a guy who doesn't want me. That sucks. My ex is a bastard. I don't miss him, I just want to feel a connection, Jude finished. Stephen glanced up from this drink. His luminous eyes regarded Jude for a moment. Yeah. The agreement was low and heartfelt. Why don't you just hang out with friends and worry about dating later? Jude thought they were both feeling set adrift. Stephen nodded his agreement, collapsing back into the corner of the sectional. My friends? It's awkward. We were together for 5 years. All of our friends are more his than mine. There are a few who don't care, but I don't feel right when I'm around them. The ex always seemed to show up to harass me, so I stopped visiting. Lately I've just been really lonely. What about you? Maybe the night wasn't as much of a washout as Jude had thought. Maybe he'd found a kindred soul. Mine left me with a handful of promises, which I believed right up to the very last moment. I accidentally outed myself to my parents, who then threw me out. My brother picked me up and brought me to San Diego. That was about a year ago. I've been trying to move past everything. It's been hard. I hear you. Every time I've tried to go out, nothing seems right. You're the first person I've invited to come home with me, but I couldn't. Stephen's voice trailed off, a pained expression crossing his face. I feel guilty, Jude said into the silence. I struggled with dating after Levi, but I caught myself comparing others to him. Then I thought I'd hook up, but afterwards I'd have this gut-wrenching ache like I cheated. Which is a fucking hoot because he doesn't want me. How can I be unfaithful to someone who walked away from me? We're a pair, aren't we? Jude nodded, glancing at the titles on the books resting on the coffee table. The ones in English were about myths, with how the books and binders were laid out. Jude wondered if Stephen was writing a paper or studying mythology. Jude asked. For a moment Stephen appeared uncomfortable. Sort of a fascination of mine. I run an antiquities shop with my father. When we receive old books, Stephen shrugged. His eyes skittered away from Jude's. I enjoy comparing old to current information. Details are lost over time. I guess you could say I collect little-known material. Jude studied Stephen's profile, mulling over the explanation. Living with Beck had opened doors to a hidden, strange world that lived alongside humanity. He Wondered if Steven was one of those who knew of the creatures that hid in the shadows. Jude wasn't rude enough to ask if Steven became his friend, and with the comfort level Jude had with Steven, he thought they could be friends. Perhaps he'd come to trust Steven enough to confide what he knew. As the conversation wound down, Jude was ready to go. Would you mind taking me home? I rode to the club with my friends. Steven seemed disappointed but agreed. Jude imagined that since Steven was cut off from his old friends, he'd simply wanted company more than a hookup. But even though he liked Steven, Jude felt melancholy and nostalgic. The last thing he wanted was to spend the rest of the evening talking about the one person he was supposed to be trying to get over. He wouldn't be good company. The trek back to the car lacked the heated fumbling of when they'd arrived. The drive to Beck's new home was quiet, but Jude didn't mind. Steven chewed on his lip as he pulled up to the condo. He glanced over to Steven. Friends. Steven sagged in his seat as he let out a gust of air. Friends, he confirmed. Look, I really am sorry about tonight. Jude waved him off. As far as he was concerned, the night had ended just fine. Some friends and I are going dancing tomorrow night. Do you want to come? Just to have fun? I won't hook up again, but I need to get out of my brother's hair. Jude grinned sheepishly. Steven's face brightened, and he gave Jude a timid smile. Thanks. That's decent of you. If you don't mind then, yeah, I'd like to go. As friends, he hastened to confirm. All right, you get to drive. Be warned, my friends will ask dozens of questions, Jude said before exiting the car. He said goodnight, closed the door, and ran up the steps to the porch. He watched Steven pull out of the driveway, waving from the stoop. Once the taillights disappeared from sight, Jude sagged against the doorframe of the new condo Beck and Diego called home. Was he trying to replace Levi too soon? He huffed a small laugh at himself. Starting over was hard when his heart wasn't into finding someone new. Exhaling loudly, Jude pushed off the doorframe. He couldn't do this again. Until he knew he was completely over Levi. It wasn't fair to nice people like Steven. Being alone wasn't so terrible, until he watched how Beck and Diego were together. He wanted what they had. Not too long ago Jude thought he'd had a love like that. A cool breeze whipped around the house, bringing with it the sharp scent of pine needles. Jude closed his eyes and inhaled, enjoying the evening air. Raising his face to the sky, he opened himself to the night around him, releasing his frustrations, searching for his center of quiet. Coming from Boston, he thought the fall evenings in San Diego were nice. He couldn't help but laugh a little at the Californians who bundled up when temperatures dropped to 60 degrees. A strange noise drew his attention to the corner of the condo. Thick shadows draped the far side of the building in inky darkness. The sound came again, snuffling, then a whimper. Jude wondered if someone's pet dog was loose. He considered what he could do to help the pooch when the whimper turned into a hair-raising growl. Jude's heart skipped a beat at the low sound. Then again there were more things that went bump in the night than stray pets. No. Being mauled on the front lawn at 11 in the evening didn't factor into Jude's night activities. He spun on his heel and retreated into the house. By Friday night standards, the hour was early. When he pushed the door open, Beck was waiting there and crushed him into a bear hug. Chapter 2. Jude. What happened, Jude? Why are you home so early? Tell me. Diego and I will kick his ass. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pressured you to go out. Beck's turquoise eyes were stormy. Holding still, Jude allowed his brother to manhandle him. Off to the side, Diego, Beck's partner, stood with his feet braced apart, arms crossed over his massive chest, and a deep scowl creasing his brow. Jude sensed Diego's watchful gaze as he laughed good-naturedly. Before pushing Beck away, nothing, absolutely nothing in this world would make him tell his brother about the debacle his attempted hookup had turned out to be. There wasn't enough alcohol on the continent to loosen his tongue on that subject. Chill out, you two. I'm just fine. I came home early, that's all. It's not the end of the world. Jude thought he sounded convincing until Diego huffed at him in a knowing manner. Beck sked like a mother hen as he took Jude's windbreaker and hung it up. His brother was slightly taller, but not by much since Jude had gone through a late growth spurt since moving to San Diego. He hoped one day he'd be as handsome as Beck. Jude's hair was a curly, dirty blonde, and not the golden honey of Beck's. His eyes were a dull gray-blue, whereas Beck's eyes were the color of a semi-precious stone. Diego claimed Jude looked like a younger version of Beck, but Jude knew better. Beck was gorgeous as well as confident and successful, attributes Jude didn't believe he had. Glancing at Diego, Jude briefly met his gaze. Diego appeared as if he had just stepped out of the shower. His shoulder-length glossy black hair was combed back from the temple. It was long enough he could gather it in a short ponytail at the nape of his neck. Dark circles from droplets of water stained the edge of the t-shirt's collar. When Beck had first introduced him to Diego Hernandez, Jude hid the fact he'd drooled embarrassingly over his brother's lover. He rarely had such a reaction, but Diego's rugged beauty mixed with a dangerous, I can rip your arms off vibe had an undeniable effect on Jude. There was an aura of strength, of power Diego radiated. When he was in close proximity to Diego, Jude swore he sensed an electric air about him. The energy rolling off Diego felt warm, soothing, and lent a sense of safety to Jude. When they were out together, Jude observed how people reacted to Diego. Men and women boldly stared at him with open desire, but at the same time, his presence intimidated them, causing people to hurriedly move out of his way. Those who didn't know Diego considered him a brute because of his size, but Jude knew better. Diego happened to be one of the kindest people he'd ever known. Even so, with everything he now knew of the world, Jude was hesitant to confide in Diego or even Beck. 4 years now, Jude held a secret close to his chest. Sometimes he encountered people who had a glow about them, not when he gazed at them straight on, but when he turned his head and regarded them from the periphery. The light appeared, shining with hints of a brilliance scattered around the person. He thought of it as an aura, although what he saw didn't meet the formal definition. He couldn't find another word to describe what he glimpsed. Not everyone he crossed paths with carried a light about them. When he was 15, he told his mom what he saw, and she had taken him to the doctors with the fear Jude had a brain tumor. After a battery of medical tests that found nothing physically wrong, and with Jude's continued insistence some people had lights around them, he'd spent a couple of years seeing a therapist. The ass's professional opinion was Jude's insecurities caused him to create something fantastical in order to be accepted. His parents translated the therapist's explanations to mean that Jude was a liar. They'd reprimanded him harshly for making things up, and Jude swore he'd never tell anyone else. Their mother had complained to Beck, but Jude didn't have the heart to speak to his brother because he didn't want risk his brother's trust and see disappointment in Beck's eyes, at least until recently. That same brightness surrounded Diego, and now his brother Beck. When they were near each other, they became a bright beacon. Jude believed that together the two of them were more than special, something extraordinary, whose significance had yet to be tapped. Jude didn't know where his conviction came from, only that it was true. Jude lived with Beck and Diego several months before he became accustomed to Diego's intensity. Diego treated him like a little brother, which was unexpected because other than Beck, few regarded Jude as if he mattered. Diego, and his relatives by extension, introduced Jude to a whole new world that redefined the meaning of family. Upon first meeting the Hernandez brood, Jude had been overwhelmed by the number of people and the amount of noise in the small house. Now he looked forward to the rambunctious Sunday dinners with people he secretly claimed as his own. Did you run into anything different or odd? Is that why you came home early? Beck asked, pulling Jude out of his own thoughts and into the present. After he'd moved in, Beck and Diego had sat him down and introduced him to the hidden paranormal world around them. If the information had come from anyone other than Diego, Jude would have told them to fuck off, but at the same time, something deep within him had already known. The time spent with his therapist had caused Jude to doubt himself. The way his parents had acted hadn't helped. His confidence was dented and bruised, making him wonder at times what was wrong with him. Was he truly going nuts, or could he see something others could not? When the therapist had suggested that if Jude persisted in his claim then he would need to be medicated, Jude never mentioned what he saw. Again, Diego's explanation of what the world was really like helped to explain the auras Jude sometimes glimpsed. If fairy tale beings walked the earth and there were humans who had extraordinary abilities, then what he saw could be something along those lines. Perhaps he wasn't such a freak. Could there be place for him where people believed him, where he could fit in? Even though he was reticent to share that part of himself. Jude did want to tell Beck and Diego, but how did he prove something no one else could see? Jude held back, as he was scared. What if Beck rejected him just as their parents had? He only saw auras. Perhaps Jude would have at least tested the waters of Beck's acceptance, but unfortunately that wasn't the only secret Jude kept. He pushed his jumbled thoughts away to answer Beck's question. No beasties, unless you count the pawing I received on the dance floor. Think I may be bruised, Jude joked, trying to break the tension that had filled the living room. You're being cautious, looking for identifiers. Beck. He interrupted. I'm serious, Jude. You have to be careful out there. Beck's expression held all the concern of an overprotective older brother. Jude couldn't find it within himself to be upset. I remember everything you and Diego taught me when I moved here. I don't need a refresher. That particular outing had been an experience he wouldn't soon forget. They had pointed out the people, the creatures that appeared to be humans walking down the street going about normal everyday business. Diego's explanation of the who and what became a litany of all the fantasy novels Jude had ever read. Werewolves who were not to be confused with shifters, people who shifted completely into various animals. A shocking 5 types of vampires. Urban shamans who were scary fuckers, and a slew of different types of witches, elves, ghouls, fairies, and zombies. The list went on. Some individuals were obvious once Jude knew what to look for. I know the world we revealed to you scared the hell out of you. You refused to leave the condo for 2 weeks, Beck reminded him. Jude flopped down on the couch. Yes and no. And I unburied myself when I realized I had lived all my life with all the weirdness around me, and I had been just fine. I did reevaluate everyone I'd known, trying to figure out if I'd been friends with a daywalker or dryad back in Boston. But that really wasn't what had kept him locked in his room. He didn't fear the creatures who lived alongside humanity. He was more afraid of himself. Not only did he sometimes see light about certain people, he now heard a voice that occasionally whispered to him. Something had woken within him with Beck and Diego's revelation. At night, when Jude was ready to sleep, a voice barged in on his thoughts, unlocking disturbing nightmares that paralyzed Jude with fear. Jude had been terrified, and he was afraid to ask for help. He'd been accused of being crazy, of being a liar before, and yet he reminded himself Beck and Diego introduced him to a new reality. Was he psychotic? Schizophrenic? Or was he a human with some kind of extrasensory perception? Would it be better to know if he lost his sanity, or to discover he belonged in that paranormal world? He didn't think he could stand it if Beck ever looked at him the way their parents had when they kicked him out of the house. Do you feel differently about Beck? Diego asked. What? Why would I? Jude asked, startled by the odd question. He glanced at Beck, who wouldn't meet his eye, a pink flush to his cheeks. He won't say anything, but he's been worried your opinion of him would change once you knew about his ability, Diego said when Beck didn't reply. Along with Diego's explanation of the other world that existed, there were humans who developed enhanced abilities, and Beck was one of them. Great speed was his brother's skill talent. Jude sat up straight. No. Have I done or said something that would make you think Beck, you're my brother. None of that matters to me. Beck continued to avoid Jude's gaze. I'd understand if you were uncomfortable. It's not every day you find out your brother can do something extraordinary. The first time Beck had demonstrated his speed, Jude had been enthralled. Wasn't the comic book speed like the Flash, but Beck was quick enough anyone could tell the action wasn't natural. Then there's dealing with me, Diego added. You went from a normal household. Not to say that having Pendejo parents is normal, but you lived unaware of the paranormal world. We brought you into a household with not only one but 2 people who aren't ordinary. Beck can be quick, but his talent isn't seen unless he uses it. On the other hand, my ability comes and goes, and on rare occasions is visible whether I want it to be or not. As I grow my ability to, Diego waved his hand as if he trying to pluck words out of the air. Control it will strengthen. I can imagine how hard it is for you to live with us. Jude rose from his seat and crossed to the kitchen. He pulled a bottle of water out of the refrigerator to buy himself a couple of minutes before he answered. He wouldn't disagree, his life had changed drastically since Beck had brought him across the country. Diego's differences weren't too dramatic. Sure, Diego had moments of great clarity, a gift that ran in his father's family, and he refused to call his visions premonitions even though Jude had witnessed Diego pull people out of danger's way seconds before disaster struck. But his abilities didn't make him a different person than the one who opened his home and heart to Jude when Beck brought him to San Diego. "I'm okay with it, both you guys," Jude said when he returned to the couch and cracked open his water. Now, neither Beck nor Diego would look at him. "What are you not saying?" he asked. The room had a tense vibe thick with expectation. Beck sat down facing Jude while Diego perched on the sofa arm. "I remember how you reacted when we explained that abilities ran in families." Jude stared, considering telling Beck about the auras and the even stranger dreams, and then he imagined Beck staring back at him with disbelief. He panicked and pushed aside his need to confide, angry at his lack of confidence, but unable to help himself. Besides, there was already too much upset in Beck's and Diego's lives at the moment. Jude didn't need to add his drama to. Instead, he said, "You need to take into consideration that the news came on top of your explanation of other hidden species. I wondered if Mom and Dad knew you were special. They've never liked me, always pawning me off on you. You were in high school with me hanging on your shirt tail because no one would have me. Even our relatives looked right through me. Everyone seemed to prefer you." He didn't mention how he'd felt guilty, as if he shouldn't be considered a part of the family. "Jude," Beck gasped with a horrified expression. "I'm so sorry. That didn't come out right." Jude placed the cap back onto the water without taking a drink. "It's not your fault. I don't blame you. You've always shown brighter than I have. You're good looking. You were a great student and athlete. On top of that, you have a great personality. People gravitate toward you. Hell, I'm one of them. But I'm not like you." Jude gave a nonchalant shrug of his shoulders. "I don't shine like the two of you do." Diego shot Jude a sharp glance that Jude ignored. Startled, he'd almost given himself away. Hurriedly, he said, "I'm okay with being normal." "Stop lying, hermano," Diego chastised. "You're no more normal than either Beck or me." "Beck, tell him so he doesn't feel the need to hide who he is." Jude's heart thumped hard in his chest. What did they know? Beck held his hand up. "I know that look. Please don't be upset. We've been waiting for you to tell us, especially after the talk about what really roams the streets. We thought you would feel more comfortable if you knew you weren't alone, that we were just as different as you. Mom complained to me about what you said you saw. I believe you. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm ready to listen." If the lid hadn't been screwed on the water, the sudden grip of Jude's fist would have created a fountain with how hard he squeezed the bottle. Thoughts started rushing through his head. If he talked to Beck, would he have to tell him about the voice that spoke to him? Could he give up both of his secrets? Well, the auras didn't seem to have been a secret at all. Beck continued as if he hadn't dropped a bomb in Jude's lap. "Mom and Dad don't know anything about what I can do. In their eyes, you and I are the same," Beck replied. Jude wanted to argue. He'd known for a long time Beck was extraordinary. If they had known while I was in high school I was gay, they would have treated me differently. I overheard their conversations when they thought we weren't around. I knew what they would think if I came out to them. I kept it to myself because you needed me. I should have come for you earlier. Instead, you were alone when you had to deal with their reactions. When their parents had discovered Jude was gay, they had called Beck and demanded he come get the queer. Jude no longer had a place in their house. Even though he hadn't felt at home with them for a very long time, their words had still hurt. After Beck had packed all of Jude's belongings into his car, he told their parents he wouldn't be back. If they had no use for one gay son, then they wouldn't have use for two. Jude had been flabbergasted, and so were their parents. Before their mom or dad could reply, they were in the car and down the road. "I relied on Levi to take care of you when I went to college," Beck confessed, his voice tinged with barely controlled anger. Jude swallowed thickly, the bottle of water forgotten in his lap. "Levi." He closed his eyes against the familiar ache. He should have kept his mouth shut about Levi. It was bad enough Beck had known how he'd been outed, but in a moment of weakness, Jude had confessed to his brother all the sordid details about his relationship, or lack thereof, with Beck's high school friend. "If I had known what he'd do, I would have found a way to bring you with me." "Jude." Beck's jaw tightened as he ground his teeth. Diego ran a hand though Beck's honey-colored hair, and the contact seemed to soothe Beck. No, I wouldn't have wanted to be a burden to you. Levi was great. Even though they hurt to say, his words were true. Levi had been a friend when Jude needed one desperately, and then later more. Yeah, great at making you fall in love with him, Beck sniped. He didn't make me do anything, Jude said defensively. Don't blame Levi. Because I've loved him since I was 13. He was good to me. He chased off the bullies after you'd gone. He was the perfect gentleman until the week before he graduated, when I couldn't keep what I felt to myself. I don't know if he would have said anything if I hadn't kissed him first. Jude grinned faintly at the bittersweet memories. In the beginning, spending time with Levi had made missing Beck more tolerable. When Jude was with Levi, he had a reason to stay away from home, where he clearly wasn't wanted. Levi had quickly become his best friend. The more time they'd spent together, the harder it had become for Jude to hide his feelings. The week of Levi's graduation, Jude had panicked. He couldn't shake the sense he'd never get another chance to tell Levi how he felt before Levi left for college. So at one of graduation parties, Jude watched as Levi had gotten really drunk. A harebrained idea had formed, and Jude had pushed his best friend into a deserted bedroom. After locking the door behind them, he'd proceeded to kiss Levi breathless. Jude had half expected a backward shove and a harsh rejection. Levi had never expressed any desire to be with him, or anyone else for that matter. When Jude had pulled away from the kiss with the dawning realization of what he'd done, the glassy-eyed look of Levi's beer buzz had disappeared. Levi regarded Jude as if he'd never seen Jude before. His resolve to tell Levi he loved him had crumbled under his panic. Levi, he'd stammered as he tried to apologize. He stumbled backwards. He'd blindly searched for the door. A plan of making a hasty retreat and hightailing it back home had formed. He'd prayed Levi was too drunk to remember Jude molesting his mouth. Perhaps Levi would laugh the whole thing off. In a couple of days his friend would graduate, and Jude, well, he hadn't wanted to think about what would happen then. He hadn't expected Levi to jerk him forward for another soul-searing kiss. From that moment on, Levi ruled Jude. All signs of Levi's drunken state had been burned away. Levi had pressed his mouth more firmly to Jude's, licking and nipping. All the while, Jude had stared into Levi's wide-open eyes, fully aware of what he was doing. Giddy with overflowing happiness, Jude had gone boneless, wrapping his arms tightly around Levi's neck and kissing him back. Jude. Diego's voice pulled him out of his memories. Have Levi's parents heard anything from the Marines about his absence? He wrote to you at least once a month for 21 months. It's been over a year since the last time you heard from him. Has he contacted anyone else besides his parents? When the letters had stopped, Jude panicked. He'd been positive Levi was in trouble, and he couldn't shake the feeling. Finally breaking down, he'd pounded on the Hammonds' door in the middle of the night. He'd worked himself into hysterics, begging Levi's mother and father for any information they had on Levi so he'd know Levi was all right. They received an email from Levi after I moved here. He'd told them he decided to re-up for another 4 years. He wanted a career in the military. That was where his future lay. Jude didn't add that a month ago, the Hammonds had told him they'd received another email stating Levi had met someone. He shouldn't have been devastated to hear the news. Technically, Levi had left him when he'd quit writing, without an explanation. To hear that over a year later Levi had found someone to fall in love with had threatened to crush Jude. He'd foolishly harbored the hope Levi would return to him, even as his logical mind told him he should move on. Even after the call from Levi's mother last month, he still didn't want to find someone else. Any rational person wouldn't still be wrapped up in an ex this long after a supposed breakup. Jude wondered if he needed closure to give him that extra push to get Levi out of his system, or was he just screwed? As much as I wish things had turned out differently, they didn't. He's chosen to lead a different life. Jude sighed around the tightening in his chest. What was I expecting? He was 18 and I was 16 when he joined the Marines. We both have grown up. He doesn't want a relationship with me anymore. I may not understand it. I thought I knew him. Levi was my best friend, and I'd like to think he would have told me if he'd outgrown us. He's never shied away from being honest, and it's out of character for him. He hasn't mentioned me to his parents since he quit writing to me. His mother thought it was strange because in his previous letters he'd explained to them what I had meant to. Yeah, she must have been mistaken. Were there any indications in his letters to you that he had second thoughts? Diego asked. None, Jude confirmed. Levi's change of heart had come out of the blue. I'm going to ask the agency if I can use some of their contacts to locate him. For Levi to suddenly cut communications like that, don't write him off yet, Jude. If we find out something happened, then we can figure out where to go from there. But if I find out he's really been screwing around, I'll tear the pendejo a new asshole, Beck growled. With Beck as angry as he was at Levi, for him to make the offer for Jude's peace of mind meant more than he could say. If the information Beck turned up confirmed that, yes, Levi Hammond had moved on, Jude would have closure, and perhaps then he could finally put Levi behind him. Was there a chance that something had gone wrong and Levi'd pushed Jude away for noble reasons? Knowing that, could Jude leave Levi? What if Beck's digging around uncovered a new can of worms, sticking Jude in limbo? What if there was a chance he could have Levi back? Would he grab it? Jude didn't know how many times in the last year he'd gone to bed vowing to leave Levi behind, only to be plagued by dreams so real Jude had been surprised to wake alone, the taste of Levi's kisses still fresh on his lips. His resolve would waver, and then he'd vow to wait longer to see if Levi would come home to him. Don't think I didn't notice you skirted my question, Jude admonished, dodging his reply to his brother. We've talked in circles for a couple of hours now. What are you not telling me? What's with all the questions about me and Levi, or about how I feel about you guys? Chapter 3. Jude. You know this gift I have runs in my familia? Diego waited for Jude to nod. It has grown stronger the last several months. I don't know how to read what I see most of the time. Beck took Diego's hand and squeezed it, lending comfort. And what? You're seeing me? Jude asked in confusion, not sure he understood what Diego was attempting to say. Yes and no. I don't know, Diego grumbled. He drew the rubber band out of his dark hair, his fierce frown giving him a foreboding expression. You could call and speak to your abuela, Beck encouraged. No, I will not talk to her, Diego barked. She could have done something to keep Hector from going to Mark's Barnabas. She could have contacted the Oracle for help. She sacrificed my brother, who is now lost in that Cabron's world. She knew Hector was alive all of this time, and yet she did nothing to get him back. What he must think of us. Anguish colored Diego's last words. That was the first Jude had heard someone in Diego's family had allowed Hector to be taken. He shared Diego's dismay. If Beck had been kidnapped, Jude knew he'd turn the world upside down to get his brother back. Beck pulled Diego off the arm of the couch, tucking Diego next to him as he whispered into Diego's ear. Beck had explained to Jude how Hector had been lured into the drug world ran by Barnabas, attacked and turned into something not human. Jude glanced away from them, the moment achingly intimate between the two. The sorrow rolling off Diego was palpable, and Jude felt like an intruder. As quietly as he could, he rose from the couch and tiptoed toward the kitchen to put his water away. Jude, Diego's voice sounded raw. Beck held Diego in a protective embrace. The white of Diego's eyes were red even though no tears fell. Be careful, hermano. Sure I will. Good night. Jude made a hasty retreat to his bedroom. He took a quick shower to wash off the night's sweat and grime. His body moved on autopilot while his mind mulled over the evening. Lately he'd become increasingly aware he was hanging on to old memories and wishes. Tonight he'd finally given voice to his number one fear. What if Levi had truly moved on? In his darkest moments that question ate at him. He didn't want to believe. The behavior didn't fit with what he knew of his best friend. Yet he had no way to discover the true answer. If Levi had found someone else, could Jude rewrite his feelings and make a different life for himself? He was afraid the answer was no. What kind of person did that make him, because he was unable to let go and move on? How could he begin to put Levi behind him and move on when his body betrayed him? In the torment of the pre-dawn hours, Jude's first waking thoughts were of Levi. His body thrummed with desire and love. He swore he smelled the sweat of Levi's skin. and Jude burned with phantom touches from the lover in his dreams. In those brief moments of sleepy fog, he was convinced Levi was lost and in need of help. Then reality set in, and Jude was the only one who struggled to find his way. He didn't know how to leave behind a love that had started before he'd even known what love was. Cracking the bathroom door, Jude peered out into the hallway. He didn't remember to grab a pair of shorts from the bedroom before he jumped into the shower, and he always felt too exposed wandering the house with only a towel to cover his ass. He kept forgetting to buy a robe. He hadn't worried about his nudity when he lived at his parents' house. He'd had the upstairs all to himself. Neither his mom nor dad ventured onto the second story, so he'd never been concerned about being seen. Shooting from the bathroom to his bedroom, he secured and locked the bedroom door behind him. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he cleaned out his pants pockets, setting everything on the nightstand before throwing the garments into the hamper. He opened his wallet and drew out a folded slip of paper. It wasn't strictly white anymore. The edges were soft, the crease thin enough to be nearly transparent. He couldn't count the number of times he'd unfolded and read the note before storing it once again in his billfold. At one time, he'd had such unshakable faith in the man he loved. It almost seemed like another time, as if it all happened to a different Jude. The days leading up to Levi's departure had been filled with quick kisses and exploration and snatched moments of solitude. There had been no sex. Jude had wanted to, but Levi had refused, claiming, "It's not about the sex, Jude, it's about us." And Jude had fallen more in love. The day after graduation, Jude's world collapsed. He had arranged to spend the night with Levi. They were lying on the carpeted floor, playing Battlefield on Xbox and eating potato chips out of the bag. Levi had been quiet the whole evening. They'd been friends for long enough he'd known Levi had something on his mind. "I enlisted with the Marines." Levi had said it so fast all the words ran together. It had taken Jude a second to decipher what had been said. The sounds of Jude's character dying in the middle of an epic battle with a chorus of explosions had faded into the background. None if it had mattered. He hadn't known Levi enlisted. The last several days he believed they would still be together after Levi graduated. All of his hopes had been crushed with one simple statement. He'd gazed at Levi with wide eyes. "What do you mean you joined the Marines? Thought you were staying here. Going to college." Here. Jude's stomach had cramped when he thought about not being able to see Levi every day. "My parents can't afford college, and the Marines will help pay for school. Signed up with the recruiter almost a month ago." Levi wouldn't meet Jude's gaze. With a sickening feeling in his stomach, he knew Levi hadn't finished. "Besides, Jude, you're only 16 and I'll be 19 soon. Your parents will skin me alive and probably try to have me arrested if they found out about us. I can put my 4 years in with the Marines. When I get out we can do whatever we want. I can't believe you didn't tell me. Why didn't you say anything? A month? Seriously? What the hell? What does my age have to do with anything?" Jude had tried to listen, but he was so upset his stomach churned. The perfect world he'd constructed was falling down around him. He hadn't wanted Levi to go away. He'd known it was selfish of him. Levi was being responsible. He was always the responsible one, and at that moment Jude had despised it. Levi had finally glanced at Jude. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with sorrow. The expression on his face was one of barely controlled agony. "Do you think I did this for me? I have loved you since." Levi had choked back tears and scrubbed at his eyes, and Jude threw himself at his best friend, straddled his lap, buried his face in Levi's neck. He clutched Levi tightly, Levi's arms encircling him as they sobbed together. "I want need to be more for you. I want it all, a relationship, a house, sharing our lives. I want to be someone you'll be proud of. If I do this, then we'll have a good start." Jude had snuffled into Levi's shoulder. "Did you mean it?" Drudging up his courage, Jude had sat up and gazed at Levi, taking in his straight nose and the curve of his lips. "Did you mean what you said?" Jude had leaned into Levi's palms when Levi cupped his cheek, brushing a soft kiss over Jude's plump lips. "Yes, I love you," he'd breathed. "For so very long. I don't know if I can ever stop." That night, they'd made out until their lips were stinging and raw. Jude had been afraid of the dawn and held tight to Levi. He'd whispered some of the sappiest things, but it had felt right as he'd lain in Levi's strong arms. He'd run his fingers through Levi's dark brown hair, memorizing the silky texture, and gazed into those huge green eyes surrounded by long sooty lashes. It had been corny and sweet and everything he'd needed at the time. In the morning, Levi had kissed him one final time before they'd left the bedroom. At the station, Levi had boarded the bus that would take him to basic training. Before climbing the steps, he'd slipped an envelope into Jude's hand. Jude had sworn he wouldn't cry, so he'd smiled and yelled and waved like a lunatic until the bus turned the corner. Spinning on his heel, he'd run to the first secluded spot he could find and read the letter with shaking hands. No matter what happens, I will always come for you. Love, Levi. Jude stared down at that same slip of paper, reliving the swirl of emotions he'd felt when he first opened the letter. All of the talk about their parents, how he felt about Beck and Diego, and his feelings for Levi had left Jude emotionally exhausted. He thought he might be able to deal with Levi moving on as long as he could confirm Levi was safe and sound and alive. Sometimes he had this sense Levi had died. Jude struggled with the sorrow that swamped him at those odd and sudden thoughts. He assumed not knowing had allowed his mind to supply the horrific scenarios. He needed to break this cycle or he'd become a freakish stalker or lose himself to depression. No, that wasn't correct. He was already losing himself to a dark downward spiral. To pull out, he needed to find the resolve to move on. Sighing heavily at his morose thoughts, he reread the note one more time before carefully folding it back up. To start over, he'd have to put Levi in the past. He opened the nightstand drawer to drop the note in, but he couldn't ignore how wrong it felt. After closing the dresser drawer, he placed the slip of paper carefully back into this wallet. Jude switched off the light and then crawled under the covers. The thought of starting over hurt too damn much. I should have told him I only ever wanted him to love me. Jude sighed into the shadows before sleep took him under. Quietly, he snuck from his abode, listening intently to ensure he had not awakened either Ramiel or Hydra. The tone of the wolf song spoke strongly to him this night, and he could not deny the beckoning call. Every full moon the pull grew, and he spent those nights watching from the shadows, yearning, imagining he could be one with them. Climbing the slope to his favorite perch, he looked out over the valley, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. Too far away to make out much detail, he tried to be content with watching the dark forms playfully frolicking. How he yearned to be among them, to laugh and tumble, running carefree in the woods. A friend spoke of others like himself who left their homes to roam the wild, searching for purpose. He wished he could leave as well, but what would Ramiel and Herta think? Would they accuse him of folly? Wish him well. Though he loved both dearly, his place was not with them. In a time when he'd lost the essence of who he was, he'd held on to a different hope, wanting desperately to belong to them. He'd been adrift, directionless, when the life he'd been born to was wrenched from him. After he'd been newly made, Ramiel and Hydra had been there to help him heal and become accustomed to his body. For their patience and soft regard, he would forever be grateful. However, he sensed there was more to come. This easy existence with his lovers was not for him. Now, more often than not, he stared at the horizon, yearning for something he could not name. One of the creatures broke away from the pack, looking up the cliffside to where he perched, moving from 4 legs to 2. The being stood staring up as if he could see who watched them. Lifting his muzzle, the creature howled long and lonely. Yelf raised his head and gave back a warbled howl of his own, responding to the question he heard there, saying, "Yes, I hear you. I too sting with lonesome's pain, my friend." All too soon, he had to hurry home and crawl between 2 warm bodies, painfully aware he did not belong. Chapter 4. Jude. Come on, lazybones. Jude pried open his eyes to glare at Diego. He rolled over and buried his face, groaning, into his pillow. Diego wasn't going to let him stay in bed. The next shake took the warmth of his blanket with it. "Let's go, Chico. Your hermano made breakfast. You'll regret not eating once you get out on the range." "I'm coming," Jude mumbled into the cotton. Diego gave him a hard sweat on the ass that had Jude jumping out of bed before Diego left the room. Jude pulled on a pair of baggy sweats and then stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his stinging ass cheek. Adding to Jude's grumpiness, no coffee would be allowed before practice. Instead, he was handed a large glass of orange juice and a plate piled high with carbs and protein. 3 times a week Diego rousted Jude out of bed to go free running. In the beginning, Jude's performance had been laughable. The only running he'd done was the half-mile, twice a week in his high school physical education class. The first time Diego had asked him to pull himself over an 8-foot wall, Jude had laughed so hard he cried. Diego had stood there regarding Jude with his arms akimbo and a wholly unamused expression. When it had struck Jude, they weren't leaving until he scaled the wall. He'd chosen to try instead of walking away. He didn't want to disappoint Beck, so he'd pushed himself even, though he'd thought he couldn't make the climb. Diego and Beck had coached Jude, encouraging him every step of the way. The ease with which the two of them vaulted the barrier just using hands and feet had shamed Jude enough that he didn't just try but kept at it until he'd gotten his skinny ass over the top. He'd fallen gracelessly to the asphalt on the other side, breath heaving from exertion, muscles screaming from the strain and covered in sweat, but he had done it. He had crowed weakly in triumph as they'd helped him to his feet. That had been almost a year ago. Now, Jude was much better at free running, but he doubted he'd ever be as good as his brother or Diego. Since then, he'd come to learn a little about the agency Beck and Diego worked for. The Oracles of Delphi ran the International Organization for Non-Humans, otherwise called ION, and were something of ambassadors, suppressors, and the security of the supernatural world. In public, Jude told people his brother worked for the security firm Jacobs, Brenner and Rogue. For confidentiality purposes, Diego and Beck never spoke of work at home, nor was Jude introduced to or given names of any other agents. The only exceptions were the people on Diego's team, which included Beck and one other, Diego's best friend Denise. He was educated on identifying the different paranormals, but outside that generous knowledge of the organization itself, he knew only the bare bones. Well, there was Diego's quest to hunt down Marx Barnabas, the criminal who had taken Diego's older brother, Hector. The only reason Jude knew that much was Diego had made him swear if he saw Marx he would turn and run the other way as fast as he could and then contact either Beck or Diego. It occurred to Jude that Beck never said anything in those conversations when Diego had explained what the two of them did for a living. Jude didn't understand Beck's silence. Diego. Breakfast had been consumed, and they were cleaning off the table. Why doesn't Beck ever talk to me about ION? After their discussion last night, Jude didn't feel he was prying. Beck's back stiffened before his shoulders slumped and his chin dropped to his chest. Diego scowled into the sink. When a person becomes an agent, there are things they swear to. One of them is to not divulge on or their constituents to outside sources or civilians without authorization. Diego pushed off the counter and pulled Beck close, running a hand up and down Beck's back. A confidentiality agreement? But you talk about it. Aren't you bound by the same rules? I made a vow, but just not the same one. Beck snorted into Diego's neck. I wanted to have a little more leeway in who I'd be able to tell without penalty, so I altered a couple of things. Even then, there are limitations to what I can speak about. I bet they didn't like that. Jude downed the rest of his juice before he started stretching and warming up. I had information they wanted. Owen knows I told you what little I did, but it could easily be justified since you live with us. Besides, I believe they're waiting for you to develop an ability as well. Jude's expression soured. I'm 20. I haven't shown any sign of speed. Maybe I don't have it in me. Beck turned in Diego's arms. You could have something different. Doesn't have to be speed. Seeing things others don't is an ability. Jude ignored the opening, saying instead, but I thought you said the speed was hereditary. Jude was confused. If he didn't inherit his brother's speed, and he didn't have premonitions like Diego, what else did he look for? He knew it couldn't be the auras because he'd always been able to see them, whereas Beck had gained his talent after an accident. He didn't believe what he sometimes saw was anything like Beck's or Diego's abilities or what ION would consider valuable. If it was, what a useless talent. Some people glow. Big fucking deal. Perhaps he should ask his brother. Unease crawled through him. Did his fear of how Beck would react prompt him to keep his secrets? Yes. Had what Jude learned over the last year revealed that Beck was open to differences in people? Yes. Maybe the answers to a couple of carefully worded questions would help him to feel more confident in talking to Beck. After Diego and Beck had revealed they already knew about the auras, his nagging guilty conscience about keeping secrets had subsided. Instead of pushing the issue aside as he usually did, Jude decided he'd wait. Perhaps his conviction and his parents' previous reaction clouded his decision more than he thought. They moved toward the door, putting on their running shoes as they prepared to leave. Having an enhanced ability is prevalent in family clusters, but it could be extraordinary hearing or empathy or a dozen other things, Diego responded, glancing at Jude as if he wanted to say more. How will I know? What would I look for? Jude rolled his shoulders, realizing he sounded grumpy, uncomfortable with testing Diego. Was this a ploy to get him talking about the auras? Beck squeezed Jude's arm. Oh, you'll know. Doing something impossible. Something you weren't able to do before. Yeah, you'll know. Jude opened his mouth to spill at least one of his secrets, and his throat closed up. They'd already guessed, hadn't they? Why did he feel suddenly vulnerable? He clamped his teeth together and glanced away from Beck's expectant gaze. As he brushed by Beck, Jude swore to himself he would talk to his brother later. He had plenty of time to find his courage. Jude walked toward the car while Beck and Diego locked up the house. The morning air was crisp and cool. The scent of sage and pine floated on the wind, the aroma wonderful as it tickled his senses. Jude turned into the breeze and searched for the source of the scent. Fresh pine wasn't something he'd smelled since leaving the east. Jude, what are you doing? Diego's concerned voice cut into his thoughts. He blinked. Beck and Diego waited by the car, watching him curiously. He stood at the curb, between the condos. He didn't recall crossing the lawn. The wind brushed against him, playfully lifting his hair. He inhaled, taking the air deep into his lungs and holding it there. He searched the street, not sure what he was looking for. Something. A hand firmly clasped his upper arm, while two more cupped his face. Diego gave him a probing look. What is it? Jude's thoughts were confused. I don't know. I thought. He shook his head. Nothing. It's nothing, he said more firmly, willing it to be so. Neither Beck nor Diego seemed convinced, but led him to the car without further questions. Jude heard a low, hair-raising growl. He glanced over his shoulder at an empty neighborhood before sliding into the back seat of the vehicle. Jude raced Diego and Beck through the urban streets of San Diego. He was well aware he wouldn't win against the two of them. Beck was fast and Diego Jude didn't know how to describe it. Diego practically flew. He made free running look effortless and beautiful. Outclassed, Jude still raced and loved every minute of it, even as he fell behind. He wasn't surprised when more free runners appeared around him. A couple of months ago, word had spread. Runners could see the famous Diego Hernandez a couple of times a week running parkour on this particular route. Occasionally, others would appear for a chance to run with Diego. What these guys hadn't realized was that the person they looked for was far, far ahead. A small smile quirked Jude's lips. They were just traveling in Diego's dust. Jude welcomed the company, even if the runners would only hang around until they understood they'd missed the popular free running star. His heart thumped a quick but steady beat. His muscles strained as he pushed, pulled, stretched, and rolled. He felt more alive with every labored breath. His thoughts only about the next obstacle, where his next grip would be, or how to absorb the shock of his landing as he rolled, the momentum pushing him. As he sprung up into a sprint, while Jude ran, he let go of his worries and fears. For a little while, his head cleared and he experienced an exhilarating peace. Catching a glimpse of two people on his right, he marveled how guys that large could move so well. Both of the runners had a glow Jude could see from the corner of his eye. Running 3 steps up a brick wall, Jude gripped the edge and flipped over the side, and then leapt 8 feet to the ledge of the building roof. The alley passed below him before he landed in a roll. Up and running, he was joined by 2 more runners on his left. Jude almost whooped from the exhilaration. Glancing over, a bad feeling churned in his gut. The newcomers looked almost identical to the 2 runners on his right, even the glow of their aura. Glancing to the right, twin pairs of ice blue eyes looked back at him. All had matching eye color, overly large hands, identical features, and had all the physical signs pointing to one of the most dangerous groups of paranormals. Werewolves. He didn't panic, only reacted. He leapt but changed his course. Instead of jumping to the next roof, he angled over to a fire escape. The rusted contraption groaned on loose hinges. As he scaled down the outside cage faster than he should have. He only had seconds, and if he lost a little skin along the way, it would be a small price to pay to stay alive. Snarling erupted above him, spurring Jude to move faster. The last 20 feet he practically fell. He struck his left forearm on the iron railing when he lost his grip and attempted to control his drop. He tucked and rolled when he hit the ground, but something sharp on the alley floor struck his hip. Jude gritted his teeth through the pain. The cloth of the sweatpants caught and ripped as he gained his feet. He ran. He attempted to recall everything he'd been taught about werewolves. They were born or turned by a bite. They transformed into classic wolfmen on the 3 days of the full moon. They lived in packs. They were aggressive, and their instincts urged them to chase, which meant he shouldn't be running from them. Searching his memory, he couldn't come up with anything in his favor. His only option was to find Beck and Diego. Pushing a burst of speed through his lagging muscles, Jude used every trick. Diego had taught him to keep one step ahead of the werewolves. He didn't have to look to know they were right behind him. Rounding the corner, Jude almost sobbed in relief to see Diego and Beck waiting with their duffel bags outside the coffee shop. Diego glanced up, eyes locked onto Jude just as Jude was grabbed by the neck of his sweatshirt. He sidestepped and made his body slow down and fall back. He bent at the waist, thrusting his arms forward. The werewolf who'd been behind him held onto the sweatshirt, which peeled off Jude as the man ran past. The collar briefly caught Jude's chin, causing his teeth forcefully clack together before the shirt slipped off, leaving Jude bare-chested. Another wolf grabbed him around the waist, heaving him off his feet. Jude roared with sheer terror and fought hard with elbows, fists, and feet until he was dropped to the ground. Crawling, scrabbling to his feet, he ran toward his brother and Diego. The two were already engaged with a couple of werewolves. Jude ran past them before turning to see if he was being pursued. The number of werewolves had grown from 4 to 6. Beck and Diego wielded foot-long metal rods and stood between Jude and the pursuers. The werewolf who held his sweatshirt didn't take his glacial eyes off Jude, a wicked snarl twisting his thin lips. Two rolled around on the concrete holding their nuts and moaning in pain. The last pair, latecomers to the little party, stood near the corner of the building studying the scene before them. A howl whipped through the morning air, and the werewolves retreated as quickly as they were able. The one who held Jude's shirt raised it to his nose and inhaled as he stared at Jude through dark hair striped with silver. Jude's skin crawled at the lewd expression on the man's face. Without a backward glance, the werewolf answered the call of retreat, taking Jude's clothing with him. Instead of following the withdrawing werewolves, Beck and Diego dropped back to Jude. The last two werewolves who'd watched the combat but hadn't engaged turned to leave. There was something familiar about one of them. Where the others had wild black hair streaked with white and crystal blue eyes, this one had dark brown hair cut straight under his ears, making him seem less feral than the others. At the corner, the strange werewolf glanced back. Jude caught his breath. Was all wrong: the elongated face, the height, the width of the shoulders, the size of his hands, all of it was wrong, and oddly right. But it was the eyes. The huge deep green eyes that Jude would know anywhere. "Levi," he gasped. Their gazes locked. The werewolf took a hesitant step toward him and held out a huge long-fingered hand. Jude pushed past Diego and Beck. It was Levi. Jude's mind was stuck on a mental loop. Levi's here. What happened? All the inconsistencies in Levi's behavior now seemed clear, but new questions replaced the old ones. He'd been changed into a werewolf, which was evident. Whatever else happened, Jude didn't care. Levi stood across the street, and that was all that mattered. Strong arms encircled his waist, caging Jude, keeping him from going to Levi. "What are you doing?" Beck exclaimed, tightening his grip. Jude struggled. "No, I have to go." The werewolf's eyes narrowed, and he snarled. There was no mistaking the threat when the werewolf stepped forward, only to be halted by another howl. Call to return. The dreams that had been plaguing Jude, the ones he'd refused to look too closely at because he was afraid the therapist had been correct, he was going crazy, only confirmed how he knew what the sound meant. Jude understood the wolf call as if he'd spent a lifetime giving or answering the song. With an expression of sorrow and regret, Levi spun on his heels and ran after his comrades. Jude struggled harder. No. Don't go. Damn it, Beck, put me down. I have to go. After him. Diego blocked Jude's sight of the retreating werewolf. He grasped Jude's face, studying him with a critical eye. Has he been spelled? Beck asked. Diego wiped away tears. Jude hadn't known he cried and held Jude's face trapped between his palms while he waited for Jude to regain his calm. Are you ready to tell us what happened? Diego asked, coolly composed. Jude panted. His body trembled from the physical exhaustion, and his mind scattered into a dozen directions at the thought of one name. Levi. Come on, Jude. I need you to focus, Diego gently chastised. I need to know what happened before I decide what to do. Did they say anything before they attacked? Did you deviate from the course I set and run into something unexpected? Jude shook his head, pulling himself together. No, I didn't go off course. They didn't say anything. I think it was my fault. Diego gave Jude a dubious look. Jude needed to keep Beck and Diego from going after the werewolves with ill intent. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became. Pulling away from Beck, Jude looked around for his shirt. I have your switch. Off, Beck said. He ran over to where he and Diego had dropped their bags. The beginning of the run was also the end, so when they finished the course they wouldn't have to walk far to the car. Beck and Diego had been waiting long enough. They had retrieved their bags from the trunk, which was fortunate, because inside were retractable batons issued to their agents, the same metal rods they'd wielded when Jude came around the corner chased by werewolves. He stalled as he mentally put together his story. Jude pulled the fresh garment over his head, walked into the coffee shop and bought a liter of water and an iced coffee. By the look on their faces, Beck and Diego knew he purposefully delayed, but he refused to be rushed. Locating a secluded corner, Jude sat down and gulped his water. It's my fault, Jude started. I was running the course and others joined me. You know how it goes. After a while I noticed a couple of werewolves. Panicked. Instead of running with them, I ran away from them. I know I shouldn't have, but by the time I realized what I'd done it was too late. We were locked into the chase. They didn't mean anything by it. They did what they'd naturally do. Do you know how dangerous that was? Beck scrubbed a hand over his face. Diego only stared at him. He didn't believe Diego bought the bullshit he'd just spewed. Jude had told the truth, essentially. He just didn't tell them the werewolves worked to close him in. A driving instinct urged him to protect Levi. Beck hated werewolves, and Jude knew from listening to their discussions that Diego's reputation with the werewolves didn't endear them to him either. Jude didn't want his brother to use the werewolves' behavior as an excuse to go after the pack. Not when the pack had someone Jude wanted. Jude drank the rest of the water and then sipped the iced coffee, furiously searching for a way to ease Diego and Beck into what he saw without tempers getting better of them. And the end there? Diego prodded, his sharp eyes regarding Jude carefully. Jude winced. He'd hoped they'd thought he'd been wound up about the chase. From their expressions, he considered withholding who was with the werewolves. Even now he wanted to doubt himself, looking across the table at his brother. And Diego, he didn't want to lie either. Evade their questions, yes, but not lie outright. I thought I recognized one of them, he confessed sullenly, unsure he was doing the right thing. Afraid of what they would do. What Owen would do. Was Levi the one still communicating with his family, or did Owen have something to do with those emails? So then why, if he told Beck and Diego, wouldn't that be the same as telling Owen? But then again, Owen possibly knew already. Jude was frustrated and confused. He wanted to trust his brother. You know one of them? Why did you call Levi's name? Beck scowled, his dislike of the werewolves evident in how he spoke of them. He imagined Beck only saw the worst of the species, and that colored his view of all werewolves. His brother constantly pressed upon Jude how dangerous they were. Who did you think you saw? Diego pushed when Jude didn't answer Beck. Jude ducked his head and took that leap of faith. Levi, he whispered. He immediately wished he could take it back. By the expression on Beck's face, he knew he shouldn't have said anything at all. What do you mean you thought you saw Levi? Beck barked, his scowl dark and foreboding. You know what, never mind, I'm mistaken. Forget about it. Anxiety washed through him and Jude stood to leave, but Beck grabbed his wrist in a steely grip. You don't get to do this, Beck hissed. Diego attempted to intercept, but Beck ignored him. You run to us terrified, chased by werewolves. Then you freak out when they leave. Now you tell us one of them could have been Levi. What the hell happened out there? Jude tugged on his arm, anger and a sense of betrayal twisting in his gut. Sorry to bother you, he bit back. It won't happen again. Jude wrenched his arm from Beck's grasp. That isn't what I meant. Please, sit back down. The harshness of Beck's expression slid off his face, replaced by one of regret. Beck grimaced when Jude stepped out of his reach and then sighed heartily. I'm worried, okay. And none of this is making sense. And you think it makes sense to me? You're the professional here. I'm just the gimp that tags along when you practice. Look, do what you want. I'm going home. I have a class in 2 hours and plans for tonight. Wrapping his anger around him like a cloak, Jude stormed out of the coffee shop without waiting for a reply. He was running from himself as much as from his brother. He should have stayed and talked, but he was hurt as much as he was furious, mad at Beck for questioning his word. He needed to turn the emotions off before he could speak civilly to Diego or his brother. He didn't want to fight and argue. Besides, all he seemed to have were more frustrating questions. What do I know, really? Could the man be someone who merely resembled Levi? Jude had seen Levi sporadically over 3 years, and this last year not at all. People changed physically as they grew older. Well, they didn't normally change into werewolves. The bigger issue was that Levi was supposed to be deployed overseas, and he'd emailed his mother less than 30 days ago. Or had he? If Jude remembered correctly, turned werewolves frequently forgot their pasts and people in their lives after their first change. As far as Jude knew, werewolves didn't serve in the military. They were too unstable and would be unavailable 3 nights of the full moon. They needed the balance of a pack. Why the subterfuge with the misleading emails? Why was someone pretending to be Levi? How had Levi gotten back to the United States? Why wasn't his family told? Could they even tell Levi's family what happened to him? Jude hailed a cab and handed over an outrageous fare to go home. It was a small price to pay for a little peace and quiet. Calculating how soon the guys would be home, Jude grabbed what Beck called the monster book and started flipping pages. He shouldn't snoop, but he doubted he would be allowed to borrow it. He desperately needed answers. The werewolf section was pitifully lacking in details. Were there female werewolves? How many members were in a pack? How was a pack run? Was there an alpha? Where did they go on the night of the full moon? How was the pack governed? Were humans or other races a part of the packs? What he did find out was how a person was turned into a werewolf. When in wolfman form on the 3 nights of the full moon, the werewolf's bite could make a human sick. To turn someone, a series of bites that transferred enough of the virus would start the change in the person bitten. They would become ill as the toxin ravaged their body until they transformed at the next full moon. Sometimes the infection killed the individual if they were in poor health or not strong enough. For those who volunteered to be changed, the werewolves must gain authorization from their ruling council. If a person was bitten and changed without permission, then the werewolf responsible would be judged a rogue and put down. If the human survived the transformation, the council would arrange for a transfer to a new pack for the safety of the newly changed. New werewolves forgot parts of, if not most, of their former lives. The memories of some were wiped to the point they even forgot their names. The newborns were notoriously harder to control because their struggle with their wolf self was more strenuous than a born werewolf's. They didn't grow up with the pack's strict discipline of a lifelong cohabitation of man and wolf. Turned werewolves were more volatile and violent. It was imperative they find a mate to help them gain the balance between their wolf and man. If they didn't, then they typically turned rogue and had to be put down. 5-year survival rate was 50%, and then every year afterwards the rate decreased by 10%. In some cases the werewolves burnt themselves out. Sort of like an internal combustion where they would fall over dead for no apparent reason. Dazed, Jude put the book back and went to take a shower. He peeled off his sweats. Dried blood had pasted the material to his skin. He'd expected it to hurt as the cloth came away from the wound, but there was nothing. No pain. No wound. There was blood, his blood, he was sure. He remembered the piercing pain as he'd rolled on the dirty alley floor. Yet there were no signs other than the stains that he'd been injured. But Jude's worry wasn't on how fast he apparently healed, but on sorting out what happened with Levi. Surely Levi didn't volunteer to be a werewolf. With the probability he'd forget everything? Not a chance. Levi was always level-headed and rational. He wouldn't willingly submit to something like that. Then he had to have been bitten by a rogue. When? Where? Was that why someone was feeding Levi's parents false information? How cruel. Levi would never be able to go back home. Why hadn't the Marines reported him dead? There was no reason for the deception, was there? His first impulse was to speak to Beck, but after what was said earlier he discarded the idea. Jude didn't want to argue with his brother. Besides, Beck and Diego were probably already hashing over the different scenarios of Levi's turning. They were the professionals, Jude wasn't. He should leave finding up to them. Jude heard Beck and Diego come home. He mulled over what he learned in the gaping holes where data had been missing. He tugged on clean clothes and grabbed his book bag. Beck pounced on him before he made it out the front door. Jude, wait. Beck doggedly followed him. I'm sorry for my reaction earlier. With your identification of Levi as a werewolf, that will open up channels for an investigation. If it is him, we'll find out what happened. You'll be able to put Levi behind you once and for all. Anticipation washed through Jude. Beck believed him. They would find Levi. I don't know what we'll be able to do for Levi. Jude slumped, leaning against the wall when his knees threatened to give out on him. Then the full weight of the rest of Beck's statement slapped Jude in the face. Why should I put him behind me when I want him back in my life? No, Jude, he's not who he used to be. He's not human. Not a man. He's been turned into a creature. A violent animal. He more than likely doesn't remember who he is, much less who you are. Beck's voice held understanding, but his expression had hardened. No, he knows me. Jude insisted. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, but hadn't the werewolf held his hand out, beckoning to Jude as if he knew him? That had to mean something, didn't it? Maybe Levi didn't remember everything about who he was, who he used to be, but Jude had looked into those familiar eyes and he couldn't imagine that Levi had forgotten him completely. Could he be reading too much into the situation? Was the hope of having Levi back making him see things that weren't there? Beck grabbed Jude's arms and shook him. No, he doesn't know you, or he would have contacted you. Listen to me. If he's a werewolf, he's not the same person he was before. He'll be violent. He'll hurt you and not mean to. He's not a monster, Jude yelled, needing to defend Levi. He jerked his arm out of Beck's grip. I know he's different. What if he was wrong and the werewolf wasn't Levi at all? He'd had a moment of doubt after the werewolves had left. Had the conversation of the night before, dredging up emotions and desires he'd kept locked down, caused him to see Levi when it was only some other poor soul? Not just different, Jude. The Levi you knew no longer exists. He's gone, and there is nothing you can do to bring him back. You can't save him because he's no longer there to be saved. Jude felt like Beck had hit him. He'd searched high and low for a reason why Levi had broken all contact with him so abruptly. He had swallowed the emails sent to Levi's parents like a sour pill. He hadn't wanted to believe, and there had been no way for him to dispute the validity of the messages without calling Levi's parents liars. No matter what evidence was given to him, something niggled at him. My werewolf. He is mine, whispered the voice Jude heard in his dreams. A normal person would be afraid, but he wasn't normal, was he? Wasn't that the purpose of Beck and Diego's talk the night before? A way to let him know they knew he was different? Or was he just fucking nuts? He'd spent the last year pretending he didn't dream of another lifetime, another him, and now, for his own peace of mind, he wanted to embrace it. He saw a special light around. People sometimes remembered ancient knowledge. Either Beck and Diego were right and this was some kind of hereditary thing, or the therapist was correct and he should be taking antipsychotics. Jude was tired of second-guessing himself, of being afraid of what others thought of him. Staring at Beck's anguished expression, as if he could feel Jude's internal chaos, Jude chose to embrace the voice. The werewolf was Levi, and Levi hadn't left him, not intentionally. According to the monster book, Levi would have been taken away from his former life and inserted into a pack. Levi was somewhere within the city, and he needed Jude Beck didn't understand. Jude refused to believe what they had together could be erased. If you see him again, you can't go near him, Beck ordered. Jude hefted the pack onto his shoulder and opened the door. Beck shoved it closed. Don't walk away. Promise me, swear you won't leave with him if he comes around again. Please tell me you won't try to find him. Packs of werewolves are dangerous. They're volatile, violent, and short-tempered. Humans don't mix with them, and when they do, they come out battered or worse, dead. Beck's voice dropped to a whisper. For all intents and purposes, Levi's dead, Jude. He stared into his brother's eyes. Crushed. Beck would believe Levi would harm him. Jude reminded himself Beck dealt with werewolves through ION and only saw the worst of the species. He could see his brother believed what he said with all of his heart. Jude shook his head, refusing to paint all werewolves with one brush. They couldn't all be bad, could they? Beck licked his lips. A pained expression crossed his face. The first year I attended college, I had a lover by the name of Alex Santiago. We were attacked by a rogue werewolf, and Alex almost died after being bitten. If you were attacked by a werewolf, why didn't you change? Jude asked. Because of my speed. Humans like me who have something more aren't affected by most of the different monster viruses. I was bitten, but it didn't have the power to change me, Beck replied with a sad smile. Alex, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. He became sick. I stayed with him through the transformation. Nothing of the Alex I'd known remained. The pack took him away and he went feral within 2 years. Denise and I put him down. What happened? Jude's heart hurt for his brother. He'd attacked a young woman. I shot him before he could hurt her. The anguish of losing someone he knew to the werewolf virus could clearly be read in his brother's expression. Jude hugged Beck tightly. I'm sorry about your friend. Did you love him? Yeah, I did, Beck rasped. Promise me, Jude. Please, he pressed. I won't look for him, I promise, he replied hastily. He understood why his brother disliked werewolves, but that didn't mean he'd share the point of view. He would be wary and respectful, but he refused to fear them. As soon as he could, Jude rushed out of the house before Beck could extract any more promises from him. He hoped that one would give Beck peace of mind because Jude wouldn't make any more vows. Stepping out on the porch, Jude scented the air. Fresh pine rode on the wind. Again, he thought about Levi standing in the middle of the street, the open expression he'd worn, the yearning in his eyes with his hand outstretched. He'd been waiting for Jude. Levi wasn't dead or over in another country, working on a relationship with someone else. Maybe his best friend was different, perhaps he had forgotten everything like Beck suggested, but something of the two of them had remained, otherwise Levi wouldn't have beckoned to him with such yearning. Somewhere in the city lived the pack Levi belonged to. The thought of seeing him again made Jude's heart pound with excitement. He was sorry about Alex and the loss Beck had experienced, but he refused to believe the same would happen to him and Levi. Jude wouldn't allow it. But he'd made a promise to his brother. Jude didn't think he'd have to search for Levi. He would come to Jude, just as he'd promised.